Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody joining us today for a new edition of our seminar series, Insights on Inequalities, which we run in collaboration with the Friedrich Ebert Foundation Geneva office. My name is Katja Huja. I'm research coordinator in the Transformative Social Policy program at UNRIST. UNRIST is an independent research institute within the UN with a mandate to conduct research on contemporary social development challenges in view of improving policies and practice. And we are particularly interested in promoting new issues and alternative viewpoints in the UN community and to leverage research from the Global South. Before I go into the details of today's seminar and introduce our distinguished speaker to you, a few announcements on this webinar. First of all, the session will be recorded and live streamed via the UNRIST YouTube channel, where it will remain available afterwards. You will see that we have enabled both a general chat box and a Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. Please use the Q&A box for questions you would like to post directly to our speaker and put any general comment or information you would like to share into the chat box. For the questions put into the Q&A box, you will also have the chance to vote for or like the different questions put forward, which will help us to identify those questions that most people would like to see answered. Our distinguished speaker today is Professor Donatella Della Porta, who will present on the topic of bringing capitalism back into social movement studies, an agenda for research and action. I think this topic is really very timely in view of the many protests we are seeing even today from Hong Kong to Cuba to South Africa. So we expect a very exciting presentation. Donatella has an impressive career, which I can only summarize in a few words. She is Professor of Political Science, Dean of the Faculty of Political and Social Sciences, and Director of the PhD program in Political Science and Sociology at the Scuola Normale Superiore in Florence, Italy. She also leads the Center on Social Movement Studies, which is called COSMOS. Among the main topics of her research are social movements, political violence, terrorism, corruption, police, and protest policing. In 2011, she was the recipient of the Mattei Dongan Prize for Distinguished Achievements in the field of political sociology. Donatella Della Porta is also honorary doctor of the Universities of Lausanne, Bucharest, Göteborg, Jyväskylä, and the University of Peloponnese. She has an impressive list of publications, is author or editor of 90 books, 150 journal articles, and 150 contributions in edited volumes. Before I give the floor to Donatella, please allow me to provide you with some background on the purpose and context of this series. The seminar series picks up the conversation from UNRIST's International Conference and Research Project, Overcoming Inequalities in a Fractured World, between elite power and social mobilization. With this inquiry, we want to specifically focus on inequality, not only as it affects the poorest 40%, the so-called bottom of the pyramid, but also in relation to elite power and various forms of social mobilization, pushing back against it, which is the topic of today's presentation. In our endeavor to provide new insights on inequality, we are proud to collaborate with a wide range of actors, UN partners, civil society activists, and renowned scholars such as Professor Della Porta. I would now like to invite Hajo Lanz, Director of the Geneva office of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, to give us his welcome remarks.
Thank you so much, Katja, and welcome, good afternoon, good morning to all of you participating in this sixth edition of our series, the joint series of UNRIST and FES. Katja just mentioned it, we started in 2018, and I still remember when I just took over the Geneva office, we had one of your colleagues, Donatella, here in Geneva, Giovanni Andrea Cornea, and with whom we discussed inequality trends in sub-Saharan Africa, which was very, very interesting and important. But we also looked at the social crisis in Germany, the decline in the heart of Europe. We looked at sharing public wealth, and we looked at universities and social inequalities in the global south. So very, very important topics that we are touching on. And today's topic is certainly of a great interest, especially to the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. Being the oldest German political foundation, we will turn 100 in 3 years. And being the social democratic political foundation, we not only have very close ties with the German, European, and global trade union movement, but are working closely together with other social movements in all parts of the world. So I, for myself, couldn't be more eager to see and hear from you, Donatella, how bringing capitalism back in social movements or studies might impact on the FES way of action. I'm really looking forward to that. Thank you so much for being with us, and let's enjoy the show. Thank you.
Thank you, Katja, and thank you, Hayo. And I'm especially an academic, so I'm not sure I can give top-down indications about actions, but I hope that in the debate we can discuss also the more practical outcomes of my own thinking and research as a sociologist and political scientist. So I wanted to address the issues of inequalities from the perspective of how social movements and social movement studies have reintroduced the issues of capitalism, which also means the issues of class, and the issues of resistance to inequalities, reflections on justice, and so on, in a field that had been considered for a long time as focusing especially on new forms of movements, more concerned with civil than with social rights, and more focusing on issues of freedom and rather than issues of justice. This was a puzzle at a certain point, even for us, scholars studying social movements, because we realized how important transformations in capitalism are, in the impact on the ways in which people protest, in the same framing of rights, how important these issues have been, since I mentioned also the history of the Ebert Stiftung, how important struggles for citizenship, which means civic, political, and social rights, have been in the development of social democracy, of trade unions, and so on. So attempt to bring capitalism back in social movement studies has been especially started to be perceived as very relevant when this struggle on social inequalities, against social inequalities, developed not only in the global south, but also started to be central also in the northern side of the globe. So issues of inequalities in the research on civil society organizations, non-governmental organizations, and social movements have re-entered the debate, especially through some empirical development. And in this presentation, I'm building upon research that I've been doing and the Center on Social Movement Studies is doing on different waves of protest that since the global justice movements about 20 years ago have strongly focused on issues of inequalities. And my claim is that one of the reasons why there has been this refocusing of attentions on inequalities has been transformation in capitalism that brought to growing inequalities also in the northern areas of the globe, and that's made especially issues of inequalities particularly outrageous because of the huge differences between the 1% and the 99%. a movement put it about 10 years ago. So I'm going to build upon research I've done on the global justice movements, but also on the anti-austerity protests, and I will be glad to discuss also the 2019 wave of protest in countries like Lebanon or Chile or Hong Kong that have in fact brought about a concern with issues of inequalities. This wave of protest in 2019 that has been sort of put off by the development of the pandemics. But I want to start with the development in the pandemics. And if you can go to the next slide in the presentation, what we have seen and we have been sort of surprised by has been that the pandemic has not stopped the type of protest that we had been developing in the last 20 years, but it has rather seen a lot of protest events focusing on central issues like health inequalities. And health inequalities became a master frame for reading the pandemics. And a lot of protests we have seen have been moved by the acknowledgement, the concern with the ways in which the pandemic had increased and made more outrageous the killing effects of inequalities. So starting from the pandemic COVID-19, what we have seen has been multiplications of protests on issues of health, on issues of social rights, on issues of labor rights. And I want to start from this reflecting on what is the pandemic COVID-19, a case of a sociologist, in order to point especially at the importance of the ways in which capitalism has developed in the spreading of the disease, but also in the spreading of protest against inequalities. So what is the pandemic COVID-19 a case of? Of course, it's presented as a unique event in history. But if we look at past events, we see also similarities with what have been defined as critical junctures. So a moment of abrupt and radical changes, and especially critical junctures of an emergency type. So in the past, we have lived through moment of very harsh decline of rights for the citizens, of decline of freedom of movements, of increasing inequalities and emergencies that have been related, for instance, with war or with other more or less natural catastrophe, or with other pandemics. Suffice to remember a pandemic that is not over, which is the one related with AIDS. So it is a unique phenomenon, but it could also be reflected upon in terms of which type of effects these critical junctures, abrupt and radical changes of an emergency type have produced in the environment. In particular, COVID-19 is a case of a health emergency type that is related with an airborne disease that has affected the everyday life of the individuals. And we know, I've seen that there are people connected from all over the world. And what we know is that the situations in which this happen is a situations that is characterized by what I've called late neoliberalism. So it is a situations in which there has been a capitalist shift that started in some countries already in the 80s and then spread all over late in the next decades. A development in which capitalism that has been always shifting between more moderate forms, including social protections, and more harsh, radical forms, more focusing on free market, has gone in the directions of less social protections, less and less trust in the capacity of the political and the states to intervene against inequalities, and instead increasing reliance on policies like deregulations, privatization, liberalizations that have drastically reduced the capacity of the states to do things that the states could do quite well in the past, like intervening to ensure the citizens at least a modicum degree of social rights. Neoliberalism in its peak had produced reactions like the global justice movements. Today is the anniversary. In these days, there is the 20 anniversaries of the Genoa Social Forum, which is one of the first events of a wave of protests that started in the South, started in Porto Alegre at one of the most important symbolic events, and that then spread in those years, criticizing, stigmatizing, especially the effect of a certain type of globalization, globalizations of capitalism was pointed at, the effect in terms of increasing inequalities between states and within states as well. I put late in the definitions, sort of resonating with reflections on late capitalism development, because my impression is that while the first wave of protest against neoliberal globalizations 20 years ago were addressing neoliberalism in its flourishing years, protests later on, like the one we are looking at in the pandemics, but also the anti-austerity forms of protest about 10 years ago, so-called 2011 wave of protest, including acampadas in Spain, in Greece, or in the United States. Then there, what was addressed was a neoliberalism that was already in crisis. So it was the moment in which also these forms of capitalism, this return to trust, blind trust in the market, this type of capitalist development that seems to be a new Karl Polanyi's type of great transformations, it clearly entered a deep crisis. So not by chance, the years 2010s were defined as years of great recession, reminding the first great recession between the First and the Second World War. So it was a neoliberalism in crisis. It was a sort of late neoliberalism, But as a sociologist, like Colin Crouch has pointed at, it is not a neoliberalism that is been dying of its crisis, but rather what we saw was what Colin Crouch called the strange non-death of neoliberalism. And if you move to the next slide, I just wanted to say a couple of words about how neoliberalism has been defined. Slides not showing, someone is saying. I don't know if it is showing now, but anyhow, I will go on. Seeing the slide is not essential. Neoliberalism has been defined as a sort of ideology characterized by the dominance of the market over the social, by a reversal of norms of general justice and principle of intervention in political intervention on the problems that the market creates, in what Polanyi called a moral type of capitalism. So a capitalism disjunct by a conceptions of a social pact. It has been developed as forms of dispossession of rights. Saskia Sassen in her work talked of a stripping off of those citizens' rights that had ensured a modicum of well-being. Still citing Polanyi, neoliberalism as an ideology has been pointed as a crusading passion, blind support for the market, with an illusion of a separation of the state and the market. And I talk about an illusions because in reality, neoliberalism needed sort of interventions by the states. Interventions, first of all, to take off a lot of those type of regulations that had protected the social from the market. So in the next slide, I go to what can we expect in terms of social movements reacting to this type of trends. And so what does it mean bringing back the reflections on inequalities as related to capitalism development when thinking about resistance to it? In social movement studies, usually the expectations for movements that developed in moment of crisis, like the one in 2011, like the one triggered by the pandemic, is that movements tend to be weak, that they tend to mobilize those who are directly affected by the crisis, but reducing at the same time the political opportunities for changes and the available resources for existing social movement organizations. If we take the pandemic as an example, what we see is that this specific crisis has been characterized on the one hand by state of exceptions, so by conditions that in order to reduce the potential for the spreading of the virus have also reduced the freedoms for the citizens, especially in terms of possibility to express their grievances. And this has been particularly evident in the global south, with the pandemic crisis being used by several authoritarian regimes to suspend citizens' rights and through increase the potential for repression. But we have also seen that for the social movement organizations active in the years 2020-2021, the pandemic has also increased a lot the challenges. So the requests for aids, if we think about social movement organizations engaged in forms of mutual help, the pandemic has made for many more, has increased, let's say, constituencies. But at the same time, we have seen that this very moment of crisis are also a moment in which internal fragmentation, diversifications between the different and within the different social groups has been increasing. So if we think in terms of crisis, we expect movement to be weakened and to be expressed especially by short type of protests that are particularly oriented to immediate and relevant needs. There is another hypothesis which is a bit related with this one, Polanyi-like, counter movements. So what Polanyi suggested is that in the moment in which the pendulum goes in the direction of free market, those who are affected by these changes, by this violation of the moral economy, tend to protest through backwards type of social movements. So what we expect is, Polanyi says, counter movements that will be oriented towards re-establishing previous conditions. All this, to a certain extent, can explain some of the characteristics of the movement that we have been developing in the waves that I've mentioned. But I think this is only part of the story and only one side of the coin. Because we have not seen just weak movements, and we have not just seen movements that look backward. But during the pandemics, as during the great recessions of 10 years ago, we have seen also what's the school, let's call it neo-Marxist school of Wallerstein, Arrighi, Beverly Silvers, and other scholars, have called anti-systemic movements. And in their assumptions, the harder the crisis, the harder has been the resistance to the crisis. Beverly Silver, in studying the development of capitalism, also recently in the Global South, stressed the fact that, as she said, where capitalism goes, conflicts follow. So that's anti-systemic movement are almost automatically produced by the development of harsh challenges. So that people living in a moment of crisis tend to react not only looking backward, but also imagining a new wave of overcoming the type of disruption in the everyday life. And in fact, when looking at the anti-austerity protest, but also looking recently at the various protests during the pandemics, what we saw were also a lot of innovative ideas. So this moment of crisis have not just been moments in which people irrationally looked at the past as the only place in which to find grounds for resistance, but they also were pushed towards inventing new words. So the financial crisis of the last decades, as well as the pandemic crisis of nowadays, is also meant moments in which discursive opportunities for changes emerged. So moment in which the very message coming from the crisis was that nothing could work according to the old rules, because the old rules have been proved unable to human development. And what we have seen in the pandemics have been, in fact, a lot of different forms of mobilization. So from the one hand, innovative forms of protest, from online protest to hybrid protest also in the street, and a new wave of strikes that often moved from grassroots type of mobilization on immediate needs into more politicized and organized forms. But we also saw developments, and innovative one, into other perspectives, which I think are relevant when thinking about potential development in action. One is knowledge production. So the pandemic has not been a moment in which activists were just sitting at home and waiting for things to change, but they were populated by a lot of initiatives in which counter-information was produced, for instance, on the ways in which the pandemic itself was hitting not every class equally, but especially had a quite a sort of epidemic development that was very much skewed towards the poor, the ethnic minorities, women's, young people, and so on. So what we find, and I think we really have to study this in the future, is a lot of thinking, a lot of interactions between different groups, trying to find alternative ways. So it has not been just looking at the past, but also trying to construct ideas about the future. And also another type of development that we saw in research on the recent movements have been towards forms of direct social actions, they've been called, or mutual help, that have been, by the way, also very relevant in the development of the labor movement in the past, and that have been revisited during the financial crisis, especially in the countries that have been mostly hit by the crisis, but also during the pandemic. So the idea of acquiring rights by acts of citizens' participation. This it meant building upon the traditions of the cooperatives, the traditions of developing alternative conceptions of and practices related to health and illnesses, but also a lot of cross-movements interactions based on ideas of solidarity. So while in the past social movements had tended to develop apart from each other, What we saw in recent times has been also a capacity for interactions between different movements. Take the climate justice movement interacting with movements more concerned with social issues. And this type of developments were often pushed from the need, pushed from the necessity to address crisis. But then they often developed in something else and something more than just self-help, because they developed in attempt to put the different fragments of the mosaic into a common frame. And in this way also to overcome divisions. The pandemic has been a moment in which divisions emerged, so I don't want to deny the type of fragmentation that has happened also at the social level. But in the social movements, what we saw was also the capacity to mobilize on issues that became relevant as a sort of common master frames. Take the Black Lives Matter protest that spread very quickly and very broadly in the midst of the pandemic. And they were addressing any issues that the pandemic has been highlighting, the intersectional nature of inequalities and actions of racism against Afro-American peoples have been protested all over the world, but not just as solidarity with the people in the United States, but also with a sort of adaptation of the reflections within each country. So even in countries like mine, Italy, or like your own in Germany, countries in which issues of colonialism and racism internally had been removed to a larger extent, have been thematized during the Black Lives Matter. But also in the Black Lives Matters, we saw the mobilizations very strongly of women and groups active on gender rights that were already mobilized against the backlash, right-wing backlash that in Italy was particularly strong with Salvini's Lega in power. But what I also wanted to point at, and then maybe I shut up and I leave some time for the discussion, is the fact that the pandemics and also the previous crisis had a sort of a paradoxical effect, because at the same time they meant people were more and more focusing on their own sufferance, on their own conditions. They were in the pandemics very often restricted in local spaces. But at the same time, the glance that they pushed for was a global one. So what we have seen is that even if people were constrained in the movements and to a certain extent also pushed towards selfish type of reactions, in the reality there was also a global vision. The pandemic is a global challenge. And I think that the spreading, for instance, of the Black Lives Matter movements more or less exactly a year ago has been also related with the fact that during the pandemic, Trump and Trump's United States had represented the evil way to address the crisis through selfishness and lack of solidarity. So I think that what developed was also a potential for connecting social movements active in different parts of the world. Some research on social movements has talked on multitudes as a sort of aggregations of different social and political groups. In the anti-austerity protest, what we have seen has been a broad coalition of the affected. Not by chance, the frames for social movements became oriented to representations of the 99%, so sort of not movements of minorities, but movements of big majorities. And what we see now is also the reflections on how the visibility of the killing effects of intersectional inequalities may be resisted through the alliances of different groups active in different countries. Last word, I think that what is interesting here is also another sort of paradox, the fact that many of these groups are very grassroots and very locally engaged, very rooted in the local areas. But at the same time, that there is a big aspirations on the thinking globally. It has been also a slogan in the past. So this is what I basically wanted to say. Sorry for the interruptions with the dog and but it is also a pandemic challenge of our time. And I give you the floor back.
Thank you very much, Donatella, for this very inspiring presentation. And you really talked us through, how to understand, the past and current engagement of social movements with the kind of transformations of capitalism and the current crisis we are experiencing. And before I go into, asking you some of the questions that were posted in the chat box, in the Q&A box from our audience, I would like to give the floor to Professor Enrique Perotzotti, who has kindly agreed to kick off our discussion with some thoughts and comments from his side. Enrique is director in the Department of Political Science and International Studies at the University Torquato di Tella, Buenos Aires, Argentina, and he's also an independent researcher at CONICET, the National Council for Scientific and Technical Research in Argentina. Enrique, tenés la palabra.
Thank you. And I was visiting researcher at UNRIS a while ago. So thank you for the invite. Thank you, Donatella, for a very interesting and inspiring presentation. I really share your concern of bridging social movement studies with back into capitalism, issues of development, what type of development, etc. And in countries like mine, Argentina is a key issue. We have exhausted a pattern of development, and we still cannot find a new one. And actually, a footnote, we have actually movements that are not anti-system, but pro-systems, the movements of the unemployed in Argentina. They want to go back, to the market economy. They had been expelled from the market economy. And as one of the leaders of the unemployed stated, we want to be exploited by capitalists again. No, this is we need to go back to capitalism, and therefore we need to find a form of capitalism that can be inclusive enough to incorporate these sectors. I found it, very, very interesting, and I have one question on this attempt to bridge a structure and agency of the structures of capitalism with citizen agency in contemporary conditions, in the sense that in the past, the bridging structures conceptually was class, and therefore parties that could politically translate this notion of class into a political program. But we had encountered both the decline of parties and the decline of class as a concept that could be help us make sense of contemporary societies. And we're encountering a new social ecology that is much more fragmented than the societies of liberal capitalism, and therefore societies that are very heterogeneous on interests, on demands, on constituencies that are much more individualized. And therefore what we have is how to move from a structure to action, to citizen agency in these contemporary conditions. And we have populism as a response, no? And the replacement of class by the people. But that is a type of project that is leads, to no citizen agency, but actually to forms of democracy that are based on charismatic leadership, etc. And therefore, on the other hand, we have social movements that by definition, they are short-term, they are issue-oriented, that they can play a role on counter democracy, but it's full for social movements to replace the role of aggregation and intermediation that political parties used to play. And therefore, I think this is a challenge for rebuilding citizen agency, that we need something more than social movements, and therefore we need to think not so much on direct democracy, but how to expand indirect democracy. No, I think that we need to expand the realm of indirect politics in order to supplement and improve the aggregating structures of liberal democracy. And this is, I would like to hear from you, well, what are you thinking in terms of institutions, of bridging institutions that could help these energies of social movements, these claims of social movements to produce some sort of collective citizen agency, not so much a disaggregated citizen agency.
Enrique, thank you very much. Do you want me to address these questions, Katia? I think they are very relevant questions, and I see two elements of them. One is how fragmented the social basis for a potential development of progressive forces is. And I agree with you that there has been a lot of fragmentation during the crisis. Even if we think about the pandemics, we see fragmentations and potential split between those who could work at home and those who were forced to go to dangerous places, those who were unemployed, and those who were made redundant, and so on. At the same time, I think that looking back at the history of the labor movements, there has always been fragmentation. So if a statement by E.P. Thompson that I found very revealing is when he says, the working class has made itself as much as it was made. So they also thinking in terms of political science, the work by Steinrocken and others pointed at the fact that the social cleavages were also influenced by the political intervention. So there was always an imagined dimension, and the unity was produced through ideology and through organization, that are two of the three elements of the Steinrockan analysis. So this brings me to your second questions about how movements and parties could interact. And what I saw, not yet in the pandemic, which is too recent, but if we think about the other two waves that I mentioned, the global justice movement and the anti-austerity protest, movements have produced parties. So we have seen a new wave of parties on the left that in Latin America meant a long time ago, for instance, PT in Brazil, but more recently MAS in Bolivia, and more recent parties in Chile. So this wave of movements have been looking for political outcomes, much more than we social movement studies would have expected from movements that appear to be very critical of political parties, existing political parties. But if we think also in Southern Europe, from Syriza that grew in Greece during the global justice movement, to Podemos that grew in Spain during the anti-austerity protest, movements that were indeed very critical of existing political parties went very quickly into electoral politics. And my impression is that they have contributed to let's say, regaining on the left voters that had been disappointed by the move towards the center, let's call it, of center-left parties. And in fact, in Spain, in Greece, in Portugal, these parties have been also very important in keeping progressive forces in power. What is important is also, I think, that these movements have tended to use other channels for entering institutions, from the different type of participatory budgeting, democratic initiatives, through also referendum. Chile nowadays is a very relevant example of movements that started in the street and have used all the channels like the referendums, not only the referendum against Pinochet constitutions, but also now participation in a process of rewriting the constitutions. And they have been extremely successful also in the electoral arena. It doesn't happen always. Ken Roberts and other scholars on Latin America, Federico Rossi and your work as well, has indicated that the situations in the region was very different between areas in which center-left parties had moved more in support of neoliberal positions and others in which they had remained more aligned on the left. But I think that's what is shown is that these movements, I think, are in the tradition of the labor movements, perceive the need to use electoral instruments and to enter institutions. Podemos was typical of these reflections. They said, from the square, we couldn't achieve what was urgently needed by our constituency to have. I think it's important.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Donatella. Enrique, if you allow me to to take over
Sure.
and ask a couple of questions that were posed actually in our question and answer box. And I would like to start with one question, and just to say that we are unfortunately already, right on time with our seminar. And I would kindly ask you to give us a couple of more minutes and to stay on if you can, to bring in some of the questions. And I will be very short in asking them. And I also asked Donatella to be concise with the answers. So one interesting question is about, how the pandemic protests, which were very much at the core of your presentation, are related to climate protests. Andrew Shepard asks, the climate protests which have been gathering force pre-pandemic, but have fizzled out during COVID. These were also innovative and perhaps captured different groups of people. So could you tell us something how you see that relationship and the dynamics actually of interactions between, pandemic, social justice protests and climate protests?
Yes. This is also a very relevant question, and I think one can answer by looking at the longer-term development in the movements mobilizing on environmental issues. That's not only since the Fridays for Future, but even before, had moved, especially through the entrance of the Global South in the struggle, it moved towards bridging social issues with climate issues. So, in fact, the movement more concerned with social issues took the name of climate justice movement, pointing at the connections. In the pandemic, this element was pointed at very strongly, both in terms of that knowledge work I was addressing before. So collection of information that showed how much the health crisis was related with the environmental crisis and through which type of mechanisms. But also pointing at ways in which issues of justice and on the other end of inequalities have to be framed in terms of right to common goods to commons like health and like climate. So we see this topic of justice very much developing, entering the environmental protest. What I would add is that the environmental movements tend to be quite divided on several issues and heterogeneous. Fridays for Future, for instance, is a movement that took different characteristics in different countries, with more concerns for social issues, for instance, in France, where social issues had already been thematized by the Yellow Vests and other movements, and less in other countries where the focus was more on environmental issues properly. But what I think will be relevant for these movements is the capacity to bridge these different issues. And what we saw is that, in fact, the pandemic has pushed this group towards also more activism, solidarity economy, the food movements, creating a short chain rather than long capitalist chains for food productions, have pointed not only at the ecological relevance, but also at the health security that this alternative practice brings about.
Thank you very much, Donatella, for that answer. And I have a couple of other questions. Maybe you know, I can ask, for example, one further question of, you know, in this current context, you know, of kind of multiple crises and the global pandemic. There is one participant asking, you know, that through the social movement theory, we often get the view that we need identifiable opponents in order to mobilize. In this current conjuncture, this is not so clear. What would you answer to Lee Pegler on this?
Yes, also opponents are usually constructed. And one of the trends during the financial crisis, but also with the global justice movement, has been to single out international targets in specific type of international organizations, like the financial institutions, the World Trade Organizations is one of these institutions that, for instance, is acquiring visibility also during the pandemics in the debate on the copyrights on medicines and so on. But also the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank have been at the center of a lot of contestations for the conditionalities that they've imposed in the global south, but also in Southern Europe, and for their type of policy positions. On the other hand, there is a very visible target. When was it? Yesterday that the owner of Virgin Airlines went to the moon. And I think that this super rich class is a very relevant symbolic class because of the meaning of them going to the moon when the people are dying on the earth, because their behavior tend to represent all the possible attack on all citizens' rights, and this type of immoral capitalism, the cynicism that Polanyi was pointing at. So I think that visible targets are there in this 1%. That can be singled out with clarity. Also, I think that from the political point of view, we saw that in the pandemic, some of the politicians that have been perceived as more cynical in addressing the pandemic. This includes Bolsonaro in Brazil, Boris Johnson in the UK, and Trump in the United States, also represented sort of challenges not only in their own countries, but mobilizing also in other countries against what has been a backlash against civil, political, and social rights. So I think that there is this construction of targets that, to a certain extent, these elitist societies and individualized and personalized tend to present quite clearly in front of us.
Thank you very much, Donatella, also for that comprehensive response. And as a matter of fact, we have a lot of interesting questions still in the chat, and I have myself loads of questions, but we are already 9 minutes beyond schedule. And in that sense, I think we have to wrap up and bring this very interesting and inspiring seminar to a close. So Donatella, thank you so much for being with us today, and especially I found it so timely, you know, how you related your wealth of knowledge on social movements, you know, both to a very fundamental question, you know, that we all have, you know, how to reconnect it to these big, you know, economic global transformations in capitalism we are seeing, you know, and also with the new events and crises happening as is the global COVID-19 crisis. And that has been truly eye-opening. And so I thank you very much for giving us that presentation, and also for engaging with the audience and our discussant Enrique on this topic. Thanks also for all the participants for being here and for asking your questions, although we couldn't answer all of them. And thank you very much also for our partner, for the Ebert Foundation, for the technical team, and also for the interpreters, you know, who have helped us to spread the word also to the Spanish-speaking audience. As a final word, also, I would like you to subscribe to our newsletter to stay informed of future events. We will continue with the seminar series, with the seminar with Boaventura de Sousa Santos in October, and you will find more information on this soon. And we would also like to ask you to fill in a short feedback survey that will appear on your screen when we close this session. So thank you very much to everybody, and hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be